welcome you to this session, this panel, this time together. I remember in February when the ad hoc group came to the Board of Church and Society and asked, can we have some kind of a luncheon, can we have a get-together at conference? And Janelle Armstrong and I talked later, and Susan Spruce and I, and we were trying to figure out, well, how large a room should we ask for at the First United Methodist Church? Maybe 25 would come, you know? And there are registered now 156. And this morning, I was asked if people could just come in and not eat and just stand around and listen. And so there was obviously a great need for this time together. I welcome all of you. You can't hear?
Just speak up, please.
I'll just have to talk louder. But I want to pray now, so if you'll bow your heads. Precious and ever-living God, we give you thanks for the diversity of your human creation. We ask you to help us to be open and accepting of one another, not only today, but in the days to come, as we hear those who will speak today. I give you thanks for our food and for those who prepared it. I ask all this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Our moderator for our panel today is an elder in the Texas Conference, Dr. Jim Bankston. And, are you our doctor? He's Mr. Reverend. And he's the pastor, though, at St. Paul's United Methodist Church, and I'm going to turn this over to him.
I also want to add my welcome to those of you who are here today. I'm glad that you've come. Just so that you will be aware, there are over 150 people here from about 60 local United Methodist churches across the Texas Annual Conference. So it is a widespread response. I think what that says to us is that there are many people all across all of our churches that are interested in the subject that brings us together at one level or another. I know that we come here with different perspectives on how the church responds to homosexuality within the church. That's why we're here today. I really look on this as a family discussion, that we have come here as a United Methodist family to talk together in mutual respect with each other about an issue that certainly is a part of all of our churches. I have been a pastor in the Texas Annual Conference for almost 30 years now. I started when I was 19 years old. And in every church I have ever served, we have had participation by people who were homosexual, and we have had parents who struggled with that issue. So this is something that affects all of our churches in very many ways all across our annual conference. It is simply an opportunity for us to gather together to acknowledge a reality and to approach it in the form of some personal stories by people on our panel today for whom this is not just an issue, but for whom this is very personal. So that'll be the format that we will follow this day. I want to say that there is a packet of material that perhaps will model some things that you might want to do in your local church. Perhaps what we do here today might be a model for what you could do in your local church. The packet, so that you wouldn't be rummaging through it all throughout the discussion here, will be available at the door as you leave. It has been put together by Mary Kay Jones and Betty Duff and others simply as a way that might be helpful to you as a resource packet if you decide to address this in any way in your local church. I agreed to moderate this because I believe it is a significant issue in the church that is better discussed than kept hidden. I believe it is a personal matter that affects many people in many different ways. and that therefore we should gather together as a loving family to talk together about our response to this very real issue amongst all of our churches and all of our people. We're basically, from my perspective, talking about people in our churches who are our sons and daughters, our friends and neighbors, and who are parents who struggle with the response of the church to this very real issue for all of us. So that's the format that we will follow. That's the plan that we'll follow. The format is that we will have these panel members who are before you spend some time with a personal message. Rather than break after each speaker, we might not ever get back to the next speaker. So we will give each person an opportunity, 5 to 8 minutes, to share a personal story. And then at the end, I think we'll have time for questions. In order for it to be fair to everyone and so that you would feel comfortable asking questions, we won't necessarily ask you to, in fact, we'll ask you not to stand up and voice your question, but I think there are pencils and paper on your table, and at any point during the presentations, if you have a question, if you would write that down. There are people in the room here. If you would just kind of discreetly hold it up, someone will pick it up, and we will deal with those questions, as many as we have time for at the end of our time together today. I think now I'll introduce the panel and then turn it over to them. Thank you. I'll just go right down the line, and I think this is the order that, it's not the order you'll speak, is it? But it's the order that I'll introduce them since they're lined up here. Marcia Chamberlain is a graduate student at Rice University and a resident here in Houston. She is a product of a United Methodist parsonage family from another conference, and she has been a US 3 missionary in Argentina and other places, and she will share her perspective in just a moment. Next to her is Stephen Walker. Stephen is a very active member of St. John's United Methodist Church here in Houston. He is the director of the HIV information program for the city of Houston. Stephen Walker. Norma Graves is a parent and a member of Memorial Drive United Methodist Church here in Houston. And Milton Jordan is the chair of the Board of Church and Society. He might like to be chair of Ordained Ministry. Board of Church and Society for the conference that has sponsored this event, and of course a United Methodist clergy member of this conference. And Jack Albright is also a pastor in the conference, and soon to be, as the appointments are read on Thursday, the district superintendent for the Houston East District. That was a surprise to some people, Jack. Okay, we'll just turn it over now first to Marcia and then right down the line. Milton's first.
Thank you. I too want to welcome all of you on behalf of the Texas Conference Board of Church and Society to this session. I appreciate your being here and look forward to further conversation with every one of you about this issue or any other issues with which the Board of Church and Society is concerned. For nearly 30 years, our United Methodist Church has struggled with the issue of homosexuality. It has never been an easy discussion. The 1996 discipline includes the following closing sentences to paragraph 65G of the social principles. I quote, "Homosexual persons, as well as heterosexual persons, are individuals of sacred worth. All persons need the ministry and guidance of the church in their struggle for human fulfillment, as well as the spiritual and emotional care of a fellowship that enables reconciling relationships with God, with others, and with self. Although we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this practice incompatible with Christian teaching, we affirm that God's grace is available to all. We commit ourselves to be in ministry for and with all persons. End of quote. These sentences reflect the official position of the United Methodist Church. It is the position of the General Board of Church and Society, and it is the position of the Texas Conference Board of Church and Society. Since 1972, each General Conference has debated and sometimes amended these sentences. I am sure that most of you who have followed these debates will acknowledge that the church has not been able to arrive at a common mind on this subject. The church needs to pursue greater knowledge and insight than it presently has. No general conference has ever acted to withhold membership in the United Methodist Church from homosexual persons. When we talk about the issue of homosexuality, we are talking about thousands of members of our church. The lives and families of so many of us and of those close to us are touched by this issue. We are called to find ways to communicate with one another in an atmosphere of respect and love for all of God's children. The Conference Board of Church and Society hopes we can move beyond our current choices of either hostility or embarrassed silence to a willingness to discuss charitably our agreements as well as our disagreements. We can find ways to make even this divisive issue a means of reconciliation and communion. In our meeting today and in all our conversation, we recognize the conscientious good faith of our brothers and sisters in the church on all sides of this controversy. Our church has produced a very helpful booklet, The Church Studies Homosexuality. It is available from Cokesbury along with a leader's guide. Careful and prayerful discussion using this study at the local, district, and conference level could lead us to more compassion in our conversation with one another and in our response to homosexual persons, their friends, and their family. I personally believe that it is a mistake to single out this particular expression of human sexuality and love as being incompatible with Christian teaching. I believe that homosexual persons in relationship with one another can embody God's love and witness to God's love, just as heterosexual people can. I came to this belief through reading and study, through prayer and discussion with others, with many of you. And I could share with you some of the scriptural and biblical, some of the theological bases for my belief. I want, though, to tell you about Joanna. Joanna is a wonderful young woman. She is also my daughter. For nearly 12 years, Joanna has lived with her life's partner, another wonderful young woman. Each year, for those 11 years, Joanna has taught me something about God's love and about compassion, and I thank her for that, and I thank God. Each year, for those 11 years, Joanna has taught me something about conversation with others whose beliefs and practices are different from my own. I thank God for that, and I thank Joanna. Each of these 11 years, Joanna has taught me something about the communion that is God's will for all God's children. I thank God for Joanna.
Hello, can everybody hear? I'm an English major at Rice, so normally I'm very careful about editing what I write, and I didn't, so you'll have to bear with me today. This is a story about me and the people I most care about.
Wait. Try it again.
This? There, okay. Okay. This is a story about me and the people I most care about, my parents, my friends, and the many church people who have been so much a part of my life for 29 years. This is my story of growing up in the United Methodist Church and being active in everything from youth groups, confirmation classes, church camps, Bible studies, bell choirs, Sunday school, and mission trips. Some of you here today know me. Many of you don't. My name is Marcia, and I'm a United Methodist PK. That's church slang for preacher's kid. My dad is a United Methodist bishop, and he and my mom live in Knoxville, Tennessee. I grew up in church parsonages and in church parlors. I grew up with a large and loving extended family, congregations of people stretched over the Virginia Conference from Richmond to Lynchburg to Springfield. I also grew up with a very big secret. It burned inside of me. It made me feel invisible, isolated, scared. I prayed for many years that a time would come for me to open up and share publicly with the church what I'm going to say to you today in the form of a letter to my parents. This letter was hard to write, and it's going to be even more difficult to read out loud to you today. That makes me sad, because the church is important to me. It helped shape me into the person I am today. It gave me the values that make me who I am. Yet over the years, it's ironically been church people that I have felt least safe about opening up to and sharing and giving all of myself, my gifts and my most intimate thoughts and dreams and hopes for the future, both my own and the church's. I'm here to confess that in order to be a whole person in the United Methodist Church, I need to bring everything I am to it. I am a lesbian, and I live my life wondering and worrying what kind of effect these 4 words have on my status as a person of worth in the church. I live my life in fear about what effect that simple statement might have on my dad's position as a bishop in this church. That's one of the main reasons I wasn't sure I wanted to do this today, but I think I'm glad to be here now. It's freeing, and I guess what I most hope for is that my story will free you too, liberate you to talk about the things that are most important to you, free you to bring your whole selves, not just parts of yourselves, as offerings to this church. I'm tired of carrying around this fear inside of me. So before I read this letter to my parents, I want to thank the United Methodist Church for fulfilling its mission today to be loving and inclusive of all persons, and for giving me this time and space to tell my story as a lesbian. And I thank all of you for coming to hear it with open hearts and minds. Here's the letter I wrote to my parents last night. They're in Hong Kong right now. They'll be surprised when they get it. May 25th, 1997. Dear Mom and Dad, it's Sunday afternoon. I want to talk with you, but you're not home. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to talk to a group of people about what it's like to be a lesbian growing up in the United Methodist Church. I'm nervous. I think that some of the people who come to hear me talk may be nervous too, perhaps because their own daughter or son is gay, or perhaps because they think they don't know any gays or lesbians in their own churches. So I just want to let you know a few things that are on my mind and heart. You and Mom may be nervous too by the time you finish reading this. The two of you have always, first I want to say how much I love and respect you. The two of you have always modeled for me what it means to be Christ-like. I credit your support, the checks for rent, the letters and email, the study packages that have been arriving steadily for the past 10 years since I left home for college. Your visits and calls, your prayers, your support, your questions. I credit all these things for helping me to speak out tomorrow. You always said that the church is like a family, and we need to acknowledge that when we're hurting and scared, as well as when we're joyful and hopeful. I'll be all of those things and more tomorrow. But thanks to you, I know I'll walk into that restaurant with a vision of what the church can be. It's what I've heard you talk about in so many of your sermons. See, Dad, I really was listening to you all those years. I think you want the church to be a place for sacred community, as well as tough dialogue, a place where people are encouraged to engage with and grapple together over tough issues, over the hardest, most heartfelt issues of their lives. I want the church to be that kind of place too, Dad. You know, last week I was looking through some of my old diaries for clues about how I felt growing up in this church. I think that from an early age I sensed that there was a large chunk of me that could not be expressed, that couldn't be shared or talked about honestly with my church friends. What would my friends think if they knew that their youth group president and Bible study leader was a lesbian? Could I still sing in the church choir if they knew? How would my being a lesbian reflect on you as my parents, and even more importantly, perhaps, you as the spiritual leaders of the church? Would they shun you because of me? Mom and Dad, these are some of the questions that I carried with me to church every Sunday. These are the things that I spent hours and hours writing about in my diary. What a struggle. I finally decided I didn't want to rock the boat, our families or the churches, so I kept silent. I floated along quietly. But I knew inside that I was drowning and that something drastic either had to change for me or I would have to leave the church. Living for 16 months among the Argentinian people as a United Methodist mission intern taught me, among other things, about the courage and love it takes to speak the truth. At 23, I realized that to save myself, I might have to rock some boats. Which is exactly what I did when I came out to you as a lesbian in 1992. I had always been the straight-A middle child who did everything right, played by all the rules, never caused problems. I even thought I might go to seminary one day and follow in your footsteps, Dad. So I'll never forget calling you that night to tell you. It was truly a long-distance family conference, full of tears and laughter and fear and listening and denial and acceptance and grace and sadness, all rolled up together. I guess it was a little messy. But I'm hoping that tomorrow will be sort of like that night with you on the phone, because I see the place our family is in today. I look back at the 5-year journey that got us here, and I know that it's because you allowed doors to be opened up that night, and for the first time in my life, I was able to walk through them completely myself. We're stronger today, aren't we, Mom and Dad? I think it's time for the church family to know I'm a lesbian. It's time for them to take that same journey. The timing seems right to me, and I want to acknowledge in this letter that it might not seem right to you. But I've missed out on too much to keep my mouth closed any longer. When you were elected bishop, Dad, I felt so proud of you, but I didn't go to your consecration service. What if someone there asked me a personal question about who I lived with, who I spent time with, who I loved? Would it have affected your ability to get elected? Would it have affected your ability to do your job? I worry about you too, Mom, because I think you feel like there aren't many people you can safely talk to about me being a lesbian. Your friends are the church, Mom, and if you don't feel free to talk to them about something that has rocked your world, then what does that say? It makes me so angry and sad. I expect more of the church I grew up in. I wish I could reverse time, Dad, and go back to last summer when you were elected a bishop in the United Methodist Church. That was such a joyous, miraculous day for you, and I had to hear the news by phone. If I could do it over, I would fly to Lake Junaluska to stand beside you and cry with you and laugh with you at that special moment. I wish that you and Mom and Russell and Sharon, I wish the whole family could stand beside me tomorrow too, lovingly, proudly. Remember that song Grandpa wrote called "We Have a Great Big God," and the way he used to sing it at all our family reunions? Well, I've carried those words around with me for a long time, and I believe them. I believe in a God and in a church family that is big enough for me to be totally myself. Mom and Dad, I love you lots. I'll call soon. XO, XO, Marcia.
Good afternoon. I am Norma Graves. My husband Dick and I have 3 children. A son Rick who is an OB-GYN in Sacramento, California. A son Kern who is a sales manager in Dallas where he lives with his wife and our 2 grandchildren. And a daughter Julie, a third-year medical student in San Antonio. I think it is always best to speak from the heart, but I must tell you that this opportunity is so important to me and I feel such responsibility that I have decided to use notes as I speak to you from my heart. This is my story of finding out we have a gay son and lesbian daughter, of my struggle to overcome old ideas picked up from our culture, both secular and religious, and of not thinking very deeply about a subject I didn't want to think too deeply about. 10 years ago, we had just come home from Dallas where our youngest son had married and were feeling life was pretty good. We were all gathered for Labor Day and a family conference at the request of our eldest son, Rick. It was pretty unusual for one of us to make such a request, so we were both interested and a little curious about what he had in mind. When we gathered in the family room after dinner, Rick told us that he is gay. He said, "This is not something I chose, but the way I was born. I hope you will eventually be able to think of it as just another part." Louder. This one's better. Is this one better? If I get it closer, does that help? So sorry. I'll backtrack only slightly. When we gathered in the family room after dinner, Rick told us that he is gay. He said, "This is not something I chose. It is the way I was born. I hope that you will eventually be able to think of it as just another part of me. It is not all of who I am, but it is an important part, and if we are to have a meaningful relationship, it is something you need to know. I know this information will not be easy for you to adjust to. It's taken me about 15 years. However, I do expect you to do just that. Eventually, I hope, and even expect, to be able to bring my friends into your home, just as I have done in the past. I am the same person I was before we began this conversation." Rick talked of always feeling different, of realizing in early junior high that he was attracted to males, and of vehemently rejecting the idea. In high school and college, he dated girls and even had some very special young women fall in love with him. He tried very, very hard to be who we all expected him to be. Not surprisingly, soon after starting medical school here at Baylor, he went into a fairly serious depression. We knew at the time that something was wrong, but we thought it was the pressure of school. He described how he twice had considered suicide and of the friends who saw him through that tough time. I'm not proud of my response. I wish I could tell you that my first thought was for him, but it was not. My strongest memory is of feeling like this giant ocean wave had just washed over me and pulled all my insides out, leaving me hollow and empty. I was stunned. The rest of the evening is pretty hazy. He gave us some books to read and the telephone numbers of several parents we knew, one from our church, who had gay children. I think we told him that we loved him, and then I think he left without us saying too much else. It would be many weeks before Rick would not be my first thought on waking in the morning and my last thought as I fell asleep at night. By the next morning, the only thing I was sure of was that Rick was my son. I loved him and I was not going to lose him over this. Nearly every waking moment was flooded with the inevitable thoughts of how did this happen? What did we do wrong? What if we'd done this or that differently? And on and on. How could we ever adjust to this? Had we failed as parents? While I did have concerns for Rick's future safety and well-being, his future happiness, most of all, I had this terrible grief for lost dreams. Dreams that had not even been articulated, but which were nevertheless there and were now dead. Who would we talk to? Our church? I grew up active in and loving the Methodist Church. Dick was raised a Baptist. In 1987, we had been committed members of Memorial Drive for about 16 years, serving and participating in many different ways. We still do. Our lives were centered around the church and trying to live and raise our families, seeking what it means to be God's people in the world. We were also socialized in the same church and same society as most of you. That means we too absorbed the shame and guilt surrounding this issue. Knowing this, you will understand that one of our first thoughts was of the church and how this impacted our relationships there. The very place we should have thought first to go for support, straight talk, and good information was the last place we considered going. There was even dread of anyone finding out. What would they say? How would they react? How would they feel about our son? Would they decide Rick is a bad person? How would it affect our friendships? What would be the reaction of our church if they heard this unspeakable news? Thus began 5 years of living in the closet, of living a secret life. The closet is dark and dank, devoid of any light or life. It is lonely and isolating. It separates friends and family by the walls it builds. Often when a child comes out of the closet, the parents go in, and we did. Rick was patient and loving with me as I asked question upon question and tried to understand what had gone wrong. Gradually, over a period of several months, we were able to comprehend that he had not chosen to be gay, nor had his friends, and we were able to embrace him and his friends. Little by little, I came out to a few of my friends who were supportive, but no better informed than I, and convinced myself that this was enough, that this was our private business and no one else needed to know. This decision for secrecy would come to dominate our lives. Then in the spring of 1992, something happened that would have profound effects on all of us. A friend at church who had just discovered she has a lesbian daughter invited us to an organization called Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, PFLAG for short. They are dedicated to keeping families together, supporting, educating, and advocating for these children. They also had a lending library, and I began to read everything I could get my hands on. I hadn't realized there were so many books on the subject and that they could shed light on my ignorance. The people of PFLAG became another family to us. We had met many wonderful gays and lesbians and their parents and friends with whom we could be ourselves and share our story. No more carefully selecting out who we could mention where and keeping track of who knew and who didn't. We were making progress, even having attended several PFLAG meetings with our daughter, who was at Rice at the time. We knew Julie had some lesbian friends and that she called herself a radical feminist, so when we saw or heard things that we didn't understand, we attributed it to that. We thought she was attending in order to be supportive of us and her brother. Then in October 1992, she asked to come over for dinner and afterwards read out loud a letter that she had written to us. It was a beautiful letter telling us she is lesbian. She thought that while this new information might take a little time adjusting to, we would be fine. Her dad did pretty well, but I was devastated. This new news called into question everything I thought I believed about life and faith and justice and motherhood and even womanhood. Even as I was learning and growing, I must have held back a small part of myself. As I was forced to let go of that last bit of denial with Julie's news, the walls of privacy, of secrecy that I had so carefully built began to crumble. I once more asked myself what had gone wrong. 2 gay children. Surely I had failed at that which had been most important to me in the world, being a good mother. If I had not been a good mother, if I had not successfully modeled womanhood to my daughter, then who was I and what did I believe? Here I was again, face to face with the big secret. What I hadn't understood was that secrets and silence are deadly. They shame and deaden our soul. They are a betrayal of the spirit. Not only are they deadly, they are contagious. They are the very antithesis of who God calls us to be. Whether out of shame or by telling ourselves it's a private matter, when we preserve these lies, this silence, we are party to oppression. Thinking that our having gay children was nobody's business preserved a silence that we were then party to the oppression of ourselves. The good part of this story is that instead of 5 years to make progress, it took about 3 months with the help of my daughter, husband, and friends at PFLAG. From tolerance 10 years ago, we have grown past acceptance to celebration of the diversity of our children. I am touched on a daily basis by the way they have moved our family out of its comfortable and yes, rather complacent middle-class existence into a wider, richer world than we would ever have known. This new experience has brought both added energy and mission to our lives. We are open about our children at our church, and I'm happy to tell you that we have had almost universal support from both staff and our friends there. I must also tell you that I feel inadequate to talk to the church about this subject. How can we talk about something that can't be talked about? I mean, really talked about, wrestled with. I long for the church to be a safe place where people can go to explore their woundedness concerning this subject without fear of being further wounded. A place to grapple with issues of faith and life around this issue without judgment or condemnation. I dream of a time when the church will break the wall of silence that divides and isolates, that wastes precious energy and lives, that makes my children outsiders. Our silence leaves a vacuum that the voices of condemnation and judgment are all too willing to fill. I dream of a time when parents will immediately turn to their church for good information and spiritual and emotional support, when shame will not be a part of this news, a time when our children will not be alienated from the church, when all our children will find the church an open and affirming place. 2 Timothy tells us that God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline. There are people of goodwill throughout the church, but they are often afraid to speak up, to lead in a powerful way, to help break this silence, afraid to help expose this wound in the body of the church to light and fresh air, to the healing rays of God's love. I look forward to the time when that will not be true. Isn't this the time? Isn't that time now?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Walker. Actually, the first thing I would like to do is congratulate Marcia, because I remember the first time I went public telling people that I was gay, and I just want to congratulate you, because I know it takes a lot of courage to do that. As I said earlier, my name is Stephen Walker. I'm a native of Honduras, but I have been living in Houston 28 out of my 29 years, so I consider myself a Houstonian. And I want to talk to you from the heart like the other panelists, and I really want to focus in on my life, and I can only do that, a very abbreviated version of that today because I only have 8 minutes. And Annette is here with time cards, so she's going to flash it on me. But just to let you know a little bit about myself, I grew up in a very loving family with a mom and a dad up until the time I was 17 years old. My parents lived together and were married. So I didn't have any of the influences people like to attribute with factors in people becoming gay or lesbian. And I am gay, in case you haven't figured that out yet. And I grew up as a Baptist. And throughout my life, I've always known that even though I'm very close to my family, that there was always something that wasn't quite different about me, that was quite different about me that wasn't the same for my sisters. It wasn't what I thought it was. One of the reasons that that I don't have notes is that I'm dyslexic, and at times, there are times when the dyslexia kicks up. So I usually memorize my speeches, or I usually speak from the top of my head, which is why they usually ramble sometimes. But I thought that was one of the differences between myself and my family, but that wasn't quite it. Because even though we were very, very close, there was always something that stood out as being completely different. And right about the age of 13, I started figuring out what that was. Because right around that time, I have a brother who's just 11 months older than I am, and 3 older brothers who were always talking about girls and how cute girls were. Well, right about the age of 13, I started realizing that girls really weren't cute to me, but boys were. And at the age of 14, one Sunday at my church, the church I was going to at the time was Mount Hebron Baptist Church, which is in southeast Houston. The pastor gave one of his sermons that he gives like clockwork every 6 months. And his sermon is titled, God Created Adam and Eve, Not Adam and Steve. So as you can imagine, a 14-year-old boy whose name happened to be Stephen, who thought he was gay, or knew he was gay, that's something that really, really had an impression on me. And my family always taught me that we always respected, not only our elders, but we really respected the people in the church, especially the pastor. So if he stood there and told me that because I was gay, I was going to go to hell, it's something that really, really, that I believed and really affected me. So I decided from that point, I would do everything I could to not become gay, to not be gay. So as I got to high school, I played every sport that was available. I spent a lot of time with my father, and I learned to take the car apart and put it back together because I thought that was some of the things men did or were supposed to do. And as I got to my sophomore, junior, and senior years of high school, I dated a lot of women because again, that's what men were supposed to do. But even though I had an exterior Steve that people knew, on the interior, I knew that it wasn't right. There were many periods during my high school years that I got severely depressed, and twice I attempted suicide. So it's because I've always known that no matter what people might have thought about me when they looked at me, they didn't know what I was going through. And all the time I felt like I was going to hell. So there were sometimes I thought I would just speed it up instead of living out a life of terror. And right around my senior years when the big AIDS explosion first hit. So of course, back at church, one of the other sermons that he preached was AIDS was God's wrath against homosexuals. So not only was I going to hell, but I was going to get AIDS. It's something that I automatically thought just because I was gay. So when I got to college, and even though it was only 40 miles outside of Houston, I thought it was far enough away that my family wouldn't be looking over my shoulder every step of the way, and my pastor wouldn't be looking over my shoulder every step of the way. So in my sophomore year of college, I met the person who eventually became my first boyfriend. And we were very good friends throughout college and until we graduated. And then we decided to move in together once we graduated. And I knew that that would immediately pose a problem because people would ask questions. But we thought we had it figured out. We were roommates throughout college. We were going to do a bachelor thing once we graduated. Eventually we would meet women or whatever, meet a fiance and get married. So I thought that would work. And it actually did. My family believed it for quite some time. At the same time that I was living with my partner, I was dating a woman. And she made an unannounced visit on our home one day. And she found a letter that I had written to him. And I think it was his birthday or something. So it might have said something that I loved him or what have you. So she confronted me with it. And she said, I found this card. What does it mean? And I thought about it and thought about it. And I said, okay. The answer is, we've been good friends for about 5 years now. So I love him like a brother. So me telling him that I love him is just a brotherly type of love. And I thought she bought it, but she didn't. And she immediately told my mother. And my mother called a family meeting at Thanksgiving. So whenever there's a family meeting, I immediately know that there's a big issue that's going to be discussed. So I walked into the living room at my mother's house, and my 2 sisters and my 4 brothers were there, along with my mother and father. And I was sitting in a chair in the middle of the room, and everybody was sitting around me. So you can just imagine the pressure that I was feeling. And I was wondering all the time what was going on, because I had no idea that it was a discussion about my sexuality. And my mother basically told me, we heard through a very reliable source that you are gay. And is it true? And at that point, I had grown to accept myself a lot more than before. And so I had always said that if my family had ever asked me if I were gay, I would never lie to them, because we had that type of relationship that we never told lies to each other. So I took a deep breath and I looked at everybody one by one and I said, no, I'm not gay. So after, I wish they would have laughed like y'all just did. But there was an eerie silence that lasted about 5 minutes where nobody said anything to anyone. And we just kind of all got up and left. So that went on for like another year. Every time I saw my mother, I knew that there was something that she wanted to say, but she wouldn't say it. And there was also something that I felt like I had to say, but I couldn't say it. And that was the fact that I was gay. And then it got to bother me so badly that I said, okay, this has got to end. So I called the family meeting, again at my parents' house, and then I came out to everybody and said, yes, I am gay. And one by one, my sisters and my brothers took turns and said, okay, you're gay, you're still Steve, we still love you. Then it got to my dad, and he was the person who I was most fearful of. And he said, oh, yeah, I knew that. Then it got to my mother, and she took a deep breath and looked at me and she said, get out of my house and don't ever come back. And that's something that really, really affected me, because I have always had a very close relationship with my mother. And to hear her say something like that to me is something I could never imagine. I could never imagine her saying that to any of her children. So for about a year and a half, I didn't speak to my mother, even though I made several attempts. If I would go over to the house, she would either run into the backyard or she would run into her room and slam the door, and she wouldn't say anything. If I called, she would hang up the phone. One Christmas, I saw her at the Galleria, and I went up to speak to her, and she walked by me as if I weren't there. So that was something that really, really troubled me, because I just couldn't believe that was the level that the relationship with my mother had progressed to. Then shortly after that, she got ill. She was in the hospital with a weird liver problem. And she was actually in the hospital for about 8 months. And during that time, I actually took unpaid leave from work, and every single day for 8 months, I was sitting next to her side at the hospital room. And during her period of time at the hospital, she would go into and out of a coma. She would say stuff that made no sense at all, and then she would be totally cognizant of herself, and she would just be totally normal. So she would say something, and you wouldn't even know if she really meant it. So one day she looked at me and she said, Steve, I realize now that no matter what, you're still my son and I love you. Then she said something that was completely crazy. So I was just wondering, I wonder if she actually remembers or she knew what she was saying. Even though the doctors told us that she would make it out of the hospital, she did. That was about 5 years ago, and until yesterday, she hadn't been back to the hospital. She's actually in the hospital right now. And for about 6 months, I was always wondering, does she remember what she said to me? So one day, just she and I were alone, and I looked at her, and I said, Mom, do you? And she stopped me mid-sentence and said, yes, I remember what I said to you, and I meant it, and I love you. So I said, wow, that's wonderful. Now I have the relationship back with my mother. At the same time that this was going on with my family, I was also having struggles with the church. Right after I graduated college, I joined Windsor Village United Methodist Church. And I always thought it was the most welcoming church I had ever been a part of. The associate pastors always referred to not only male and female relationships, but they always referred to male-male and female-female relationships. And that was something that I had never heard in church before. Then suddenly, for some reason that I still cannot understand, the pastor's wife gave a sermon, and she does that all the time. And she just stood up and she decided that her topic of discussion were abominations. And she said the number one abomination, of course, is homosexuals. And all homosexuals are an abomination against the church, against God, and they have no place in our church. So that was the last time that was the last second I was ever a member of Windsor Village, because I immediately got up and left. Not only did I leave, I called and I sent letters letting them know that I was gay, and that I was extremely offended by what had happened, and I was hoping that one day I would be able to return. So about 2.5 years passed, and I actually had not gone to church at all, because I said I would never ever go to another church where I couldn't be an openly gay person. And being the president of a local gay and lesbian organization, it was sort of hard for me to continue to try to live a life in a closet. And I certainly feel like I don't have to live in a closet for God, because I feel like He is directing me and He tells me where to go, and I just follow His lead. So a friend of mine was in town from San Francisco, and he had heard about this church, St. John's United Methodist. And I had heard about it also because it was actually the sister church of Windsor Village. And so he said, well, why don't we go? And I explained to him why I decided not to go to church. And I guess the easy thing, and one of the things that a lot of lesbians and gays do, is join a lesbian or gay church. And I decided not to do that because as we create separate entities, there are lots of reasons for it, but we don't need to create separate entities from God, because He is an all-loving God. So I decided that I wouldn't do that. So we went to St. John's, and it was really, really weird, and I know that God led me to St. John's on Sunday, February 8th, 1996, because Rudy's sermon that day was about homophobia. He apparently had seen a program on public television the night before that was dealing with the issues of homophobia, and he actually did a sermon off the top of his head and just said that St. John's has always been a welcoming church, but from that point on, homophobia was no longer welcomed at St. John's United Methodist. And I was stunned, and I couldn't believe that I had heard what I heard. And I kind of looked at my friend, and I said, what did he say? So he repeated himself, and we both stood up and gave Rudy a standing ovation, which shortly thereafter, several other people joined in. So I immediately, on the spot, joined St. John's, and I've been a member since. So that's basically my story.
I think we have heard the testimonials of the heart. I'm always moved by stories. Stories are what form communities. Communities are bound together by stories. And one of the stories that we have heard here is also a story about a particular community that we call the church, and the United Methodist Church. The United Methodist Church is bound together by stories, a biblical story, a traditional story, a story of Mr. Wesley, and certain standards that we have in the United Methodist Church. They're called doctrinal standards. Those standards, according to a restrictive rule, are not to be altered by the General Conference. There is a good bit of intellectual debate about these standards as to whether the rules for societies are as doctrinally important as the 44 standard sermons. So what I'm going to say and try to share with you briefly is, I come to this agenda and to this table not so much I feast on the heart, but I need to also say that I come from the head. That as United Methodists, we are bound together in community by certain standards. Those standards have places in which we have to affirm, and we dialogue. The social principle statement is not a part of the traditional doctrinal standards. It is a gift to the church for us to be able to dialogue. If we can dialogue, and if we can talk, we have community. If we have secrets, the community suffers and is fragmented. We've lived, and I've lived, a long life in which there have been many secrets. I have discovered that many of the secrets that we have about homosexuality have hurt and been very painful to people, and that is not the role of the church. The church, as a community that is bound together, must say the atmosphere and environment is available so that what has been said here this afternoon can become open, and we can embrace the stories that are there. The church also must be a place of justice. We cannot take and be unjust to some people while overlooking the injustice of other situations. Consistency is what binds community together also. I think if the church were able to come to the place where it can come to the table to hear stories of homosexuals and their families, stories about heterosexuals and their families, and the problems that that has presented, that we will be able to be a reconciling community. I have difficulty understanding how the church cannot be, or is not called to be, a reconciling community. It seems to be the mandate is always upon us, that that's the commission that's been given to us. That the reconciliation that God broke down the barriers that existed between us in Jesus Christ, and the barriers that separate us from each other are broken down. I thank God in my way, sometimes a little more from the head than the heart, to be able to say that I have come to a place of growth and openness, and to be able to dialogue with people about the issue of sexual orientation. I grew up in East Texas. I grew up 150 years ago in East Texas. I'm not going to tell you all my secrets in East Texas either. But if that's the question that is asked, are we going on in grace? Then the church has to say we must be a place where this kind of conversation takes place. This is where we must have the table that is set where we can converse with each other without condemnation, and also without not being able to say that some people are superior to other people, that we come together as a people on the grace of God. I think I'll end my statement there. I can't read mine, I'm blind, so Stephen is dyslexic, so we really got the handicap are well represented here today.
Most 150-year-old people are blind. Okay. I haven't had a chance, obviously, to look at these questions. So, Susan, is there any order here? Just kind of take them from the top? Okay. These are your questions, so I suppose it really doesn't matter. And I guess we'll decide after I read them if there's any one person in particular that ought to respond. We've got quite a few here, so I'd ask you just to try to be succinct in your answer and be direct and speak from the heart. I think you've proven you'll do that. Did you choose to be gay? If so, why? Or were you born that way? Do you have the ability to change?
That's one of the questions that I answer all the time. It's one that people ask me all the time. No, I did not choose to be gay. Yes, I was born this way. And as I go out and do speaking, I do a lot of speaking to predominantly African-American audiences, and that's one of the things that people challenge me on, because for some people feel as if homosexuality is something that was Euro-imported into the black community, meaning it was something that white people gave black people to do. And the way I always answer that is to say, okay, you're absolutely right. White people did this. When I was an infant in a hospital, a white gay nurse came into my room and sprinkled magic dust on me. And he said, "This is going to be a black gay man." That's how I answered that.
Marcia said she would affirm that answer and not address it herself. Are you familiar with the growing Christ-centered movement within the United Methodist Church called Transforming Congregations, which provides information and resources in the ministry of healing and transforming homosexuals based on loving compassion, Scripture, and the Book of Discipline of the United Methodist Church? Gays can and do change. We love to accept everyone as God's child, but just accepting this lifestyle is not the only option for the homosexual.
Oh, I got it, Mike. We are, I think all of us, well aware of the existence of the Transforming Congregation movement, not only within the United Methodist Church, but within several other denominations. The study guide to which I referred earlier, The Church Studies Homosexuality, has comments about the transforming congregations, has the necessary addresses in order to communicate with the transforming congregations. Nothing that I have said, or that anyone else I think on this panel has said, should in any way be taken to mean that if lesbian or gay people determine that they would be improved their lives by making such a transformation, that they shouldn't do it. It is not our purpose here to say that this should never happen, or that the transforming congregations are in some way not doing the work of the church.
I'd just like to add to that from a very personal standpoint, and that is, I don't feel like I need to be healed. I feel very whole and alive, and so it's painful for me personally to hear that kind of statement. And again, I can affirm what you're saying too, that if some people decide that, I'm speaking from a very personal standpoint, but I don't feel like I need to be healed, and I don't feel like my parents think I need to be healed, and I definitely don't think God feels like I need to be healed.
And I want to echo what Marcia just said, and this is not to be rude, because that's not what my intention, but if you can just imagine yourself trying to transform to being a lesbian or gay, it's just that easy for lesbians or gays to transform to be heterosexual.
Knowing a number of people who have been in one or another of these movements and seeing the agony that they put themselves through, I would not want to say that someone cannot make a decision, and I feel like Steve, I don't want to be ungracious about anyone's question. If you tell someone they're bad enough, long enough, if you put them down hard enough and convince them that they are an abomination, then why wouldn't they try to make a decision to conduct their lives in a way that would cause you to withdraw those kinds of adjectives?
Oh.